One of the most neglected books in the Old Testament is the book of Ezekiel. We don't enjoy reading Ezekiel like we would enjoy reading Jeremiah, for example, because Ezekiel is filled with so many signs and symbols that some of it gets a little confusing. Some of those signs and symbols are explained. Some of them are not. But Ezekiel has some very, very fine, down-to-earth admonition for us that says something about the importance of being watchmen. I'm going to combine the 18th chapter, a portion of the 18th chapter, with a portion also of the first chapter, and then a few things from the 33rd chapter, so that we will get kind of a general picture of some of the things that this man Ezekiel has to say to us. In the beginning of the 18th chapter, he says, "The word of the Lord came to me. What do you people mean by quoting the proverb about Israel, the land of Israel? The fathers ate sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel. For every living soul belongs to me, the Father as well as the Son. Both alike belong to me. The soul who sins is the one who will die." The following verses then give us a description of the good man and the evil man. And then in verse 10 he says, "Suppose he," that is, this man who has a violent son, who sheds blood, or does any of those other things, though the father has done none of them. And then he goes on and mentions some of the things that this person does. "Will such a man live," he says in verse 13, "will such a man live? He will not, because he has done those detestable things. He will surely be put to death, and his blood will be on his own head. But suppose this son has a son who sees all of the sins of his father, and though he sees them, he does not do such things." And then he goes on and mentions some of these terrible sins again. In the latter part of verse 17 he says, "This man will not die for his father's sins. He will surely live, but his father will die for his own sins, because he has practiced extortion, robbed his brother, and did what was wrong among the people." Well, at first we think to ourselves, yes, that's the way it ought to be, That's the way life is supposed to be. You suffer for your own sins. There was an interesting thing that took place, or is thought to have taken place, among the Israelites, and certainly did take place among some of the pagan nations. You have to realize that Israel became a pagan nation at various times. They set God aside and became idolatrous, and this was one of the great faults of the Israelite people. But here's kind of what was thought: that a father can assign his sins to his son, and then his son will suffer. The father won't suffer, but the sons will suffer. And so there was the idea among pagans that you could trade off some of your bad deeds and things like this. And we can't help but wonder if Ezekiel is not kind of referring to some of this type of thing. Ordinarily, what do we do? Ordinarily, we say, if you do it, you suffer the consequences of it. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Here's a father who is a drunkard. Here's a father who is a drug addict. Here's a father who is abusive and negligent. He beats up his wife, he beats up his children, he abuses people, all of these things, but he himself doesn't suffer. It's the people around him who suffer. It's the people who are affected who are suffering. And so the Jewish people had a sort of a proverbial saying They said the fathers ate sour grapes. Have you ever eaten sour grapes? What does that do to your teeth? Makes your teeth kind of rough, yeah. Peggy Jo's making a face at it. You can tell she's okay. But it's called setting your teeth on edge. And so I eat the sour grapes and my teeth feel funny. But when I eat my sour grapes, the proverb was that the fathers eat sour grapes, but what? The children's teeth are set on edge. So I think that his lesson here is the idea that the sins of my life are not confined to me. I am the guilty one, yes, but they're not confined to me. The consequences of my bad life, the consequences of my sins may be felt by the next generation, may be felt by my neighbors, may be felt by any one of a number of different people. And so Paul says, no one lives to himself and no one dies to himself. So what is the lesson? The lesson, I think, is that you and I had better watch out about the kind of life that we live. The favorite thing among the politicians, and we just heard it again, favorite thing among the politicians is when a politician gets caught at something, what does that politician say? I take full responsibility. So I pull out my gun and I shoot Abigail and kill her. And then I go to Jess and say, Jess, I take full responsibility for that. What good did that do? That didn't do any good. For me to admit accountability or to admit responsibility is not the point. The point is that we need to learn that the life that we live is shared in its consequences by many people around us. Now, on the other hand, the good that we do is the same way. The good that we do is seldom confined to just one person or the person to whom we do that good or for whom we do that good. Instead, when we do good to people, word gets around that what? Joe is a good person. Ruth is a good person. Word gets around that here is a person that maybe you can trust. I've had friends in the business world, and they said, you know, I wouldn't trust him any farther than I could throw him. And then I've said that myself. And then I've also heard people say, you know, if he says that's the way it is, that's the way it is. What happens? We establish within the framework of people that we're with, we establish a kind of character that we really are. And people say, here is a man that if he tells you something, you can depend on it. My mother was, you talk about a person of integrity, she was a person of integrity. She could not stand the slightest mistruth or misrepresentation, and boy, did she ever teach us honesty. Now, I'm not saying that I always learned it very well, but boy, she was honest. When my father died, my mother had a difficult time, and my brother was a doctor, but a doctor friend of his cared for my father. Now, if you got that all straight. This doctor friend said to my brother, I told your mother to take this sleeping pill tonight, and she said she would, but she probably won't. My brother turned and said, if she said she will, it's as good as in her stomach. What had been established here? there had been established an air of truth, an air of integrity. That air of integrity is so very, very important. So we don't ever lie. We don't ever misrepresent. Why? Because that develops a reputation of it may be true, it may not be true. And so what Ezekiel is talking about here is to recognize, well, actually there are 4 characters here, but to recognize something about each set of these 4 characters. Number 1, you are responsible to God for your life. You're not going to ride to heaven, so to speak. You're not going to ride to heaven on the coattails of someone else. You're not going to ride to heaven because your parents were good Christian people. You're not going to go to heaven because your spouse is a good person. The opposite is also true. Ezekiel talks about the man who is charged with warning the other person. Very popular today. Well, everybody has his own religion, and I'm not going to interfere with so-and-so's religion. If that's what he believes, that's what he believes. And here's another man who has a different religion that contradicts that. Well, if that's what he believes, that's all right. That's his business. No, Ezekiel is telling us this, that know the Word of God, know what's right and what's wrong, stand up for it. And then he puts it like this. He says, now, Ezekiel, if you do not warn these people, your charge, it's the nation that he was talking about. If you don't carry my word to the nation, hey, guess what? They're going to perish. But you're going to be responsible. Why? Because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. As a messenger from God, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Now, I'm not trying to say, and I don't think Ezekiel is saying this either, that we're supposed to park on every street corner, and do street preaching and things like this. But stop and think about the people with whom you are most closely associated and the people that you have influence with, the people that you have rapport with. Are they just no part of your responsibility, of my responsibility? No, you don't have to cram Christ down their throats. But we do have to live in such a way that they see that, hey, that person is different than the other people that I know. And so the idea of Ezekiel here is that we have a responsibility to carry the word to other people. People who do not know. We have the responsibility of carrying that word. How do we do that? Well, we do that in quite a number of different ways. Sometimes we can do that simply by the kind of life that we live. Sometimes there are opportunities that are presented to us where we can sit down and teach people when they invite us to do so, when they want to listen to such things. Various people have different ways of doing this. Let me tell you a story that I've told to some of you I know. In the congregation that I grew up in, there was a fellow there by the name of Brother Lyons. Brother Lyons was an uneducated man, didn't have any public skills or anything like this, But Brother Lyons spoke out for the Lord with the opportunities that came to him. And some people kind of thought he was a very strange kind of a person, but it's kind of interesting to me. My dad was an elder in that congregation, and it's kind of interesting to me that Dad said one day, we've got these evangelistic meetings that we have every year, and 2 or 3 people will be baptized maybe during those meetings. He said, almost every one of them were friends of Brother Lyons. What about that now? Sometimes the most unexpected people can have such great influence on others. Now, what am I trying to say? I'm not trying to say this. I'm not trying to say that every single person needs to go out and find somebody you can sit down and teach. That isn't what I'm trying to say. Some people can do that well, and other people really cannot. So what I'm trying to get us to see is that, as the old saying goes, bloom where you've been planted. Whatever your gifts are, whatever your character traits are, and whatever things you do best, do those things to the glory of God. Let your light so shine, Jesus says, that other men will see not your teaching, not your preaching, but see your good works and glorify God. Not you. They don't glorify you, they glorify God. Why? Because they recognize that you are acting as a Christian ought to act. Now, that's the 18th chapter. Let me go back over to the first chapter of Ezekiel, and we'll get acquainted with Ezekiel on a little different plane right here. A little background to this. And this really is where the title to the sermon came, The Watchman. Ezekiel prophesied, he worked among the people of the exile. Let's talk about the exile for just a moment. In the latter 100 years or so, 70 years or so, of the history of Judah, the southern kingdom, they became very evil. The people became very wicked, very evil. And one good king came in there by the name of Hezekiah, and then after him it was downhill all the way. God warned through Jeremiah, for example. God warned the people over and over, you keep this up, you keep this idolatry up, you keep this infidelity up, and you're going to go into exile. You're going to be invaded by the Babylonians, and they're going to take you to their country as captives, slaves. Well, there were some other prophets there too. And the other prophet said, forget it. Jeremiah doesn't know what he's talking about. Jeremiah is a prophet of gloom and doom. But I'll tell you what, God's going to continue to bless you. You're going to have good crops. Nobody's going to invade you. Nothing bad is going to happen. Well, the time came about 586, and the armies of the Babylonians came and invaded Jerusalem, took the king captive, murdered his son right in front of him, and then punched his eyes out. The people were taken into captivity where they stayed for 70 years. It was a brutal thing that happened to them. And all of a sudden now, they're sitting back saying, maybe we should listen to Jeremiah. Well, Ezekiel worked during that captivity. And things were very, very bad. We don't know exactly what the circumstances here were, but he just says that he was among the exiles at the river Chebar. And then he says the heavens were opened to him, and he saw this grand vision. As this vision progressed, God spoke to Ezekiel and said, Ezekiel, I want you to speak to the people in my behalf. And then he goes on and expresses this a little bit further through the 3rd chapter. And then in the 3rd chapter, in the 16th verse, after he had waited 7 days, as he was told to, after the 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. And by the way, over and over and over in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel is addressed as Son of Man. we don't know the full impact of this statement or of this connotation. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning for me. Now, the picture, although the picture is not the situation that they were in, the picture of the watchman is really what's important here. Because on the walls of a city, especially if the city was in any kind of danger, on the walls of the city they would have watchmen stationed around the walls. And the watchmen would look out and see if there was any movement out there, if there was any army approaching or anything like this, particularly if they were camouflaged and at night and sneaking in on the whole thing. And so the watchman was very, very important. The watchman sees something suspicious and he says, probably nothing. And now the city is invaded. Who's responsible? The watchman. And here Ezekiel says, this is what I'm doing. I'm making you a watchman for the house of Israel. So I want you to speak to them for me and give them fair warning. When I say to a wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not warn him or speak of him, it's desolate for him in his evil ways in order to save his life, that wicked man will die for his sins, but I'll hold you accountable for his blood. Some famous words from the 3rd chapter of Genesis, 4th chapter of Genesis. You remember the story of Cain and Abel? Abel offered a sacrifice to God that was acceptable, and Cain's sacrifice was not acceptable. Cain got angry over this, and he killed his brother. And then when God said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? Am I his caretaker? Am I my brother's keeper? Well, sometimes we think we can fool God kind of like we fool people. Am I responsible for my brother? Am I responsible for the people around me? Do I bear any responsibility for carrying the gospel to others? What about that now? Now again, I'm not trying to say we ought to all be teachers, all be evangelists, all be this or all be that. But I am saying this, that whatever your gift is, whatever you do well, stop and try to think of how can I use that for the glory of God. And so he says to this man Ezekiel, if this wicked man dies in his sins, he'll be lost. But I'll hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn the wicked man, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his evil ways, he will die for his sin, but you've saved yourself. So there's a certain message of comfort here. It isn't just the idea of discharging one's responsibility, but it involves that. I must discharge my responsibility in reference to this, but not so I can go away and say, well, I've done my duty. No, we can't convert all of the people that we meet, that we see, that we talk to. There's a story that comes out of pretty ancient times. It's a story of a little boy, and he's walking down the seashore on the beach, and there's a bunch of starfish that are washed up on land, and starfish can't walk, and they can't get back in the water. And so those starfish are going to die. And this little boy would walk around, he'd pick up the starfish and throw it back in the water. And as he was walking down, there was a man down there, and this man kind of laughed at him and said, "Son, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm trying to save these starfish." And this man just kind of laughed at him and said, "Well, there's so many of them, that's a hopeless job, that you can't help all these starfish." The little boy didn't wake up, didn't look up at all, reached down, picked up another starfish, threw it out in the water, and said, "I helped that one." I helped that one. I think that's what Ezekiel is telling us. There's so much for us to do, it's overwhelming. But God says to Ezekiel, "I made you a watchman." God says to us basically the same thing. What were the last words of Christ? The Great Commission, go teach. How do we do that? We go by helping others go. We go by living the kind of life that God wants us to live. We go by teaching. We go by a whole lot of different ways. But you see, the early church, and by the early church, I mean the latter part of the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and so forth, the congregations were less than the size of the Burbank church for the most part. We had 35 or so present this morning. We're small. We look at ourselves as very weak. Okay. But are we using that as an excuse for not doing what we ought to do? The early church was this way. The early church was very dedicated. Some of them lost their job because they were Christians. Some of them businesses were boycotted because they were Christians. They had all kinds of problems because they were Christians. Some were put in jail just because they were Christians. Some were beheaded because they were Christians. Some were persecuted because they were Christians. Some husbands left their wives because their wives had become Christians. But you know what? The paganism of Rome moved on very strongly. But by the year 325, there was a man by the name of Constantine, and he declared, because of, well, he did it, I think, for political reasons, but he declared Christianity to now be a legitimate or a legal religion. Christianity did not conquer the Roman Empire because Christians were so strong in military might, in financial things. They were not strong in any of these things. They were in the minority. They were weak. They were frequently slaves. They were frequently uneducated. But they lived lives of absolute dedication to God. And the pagans around them saw what was going on. And the greatest teaching that they got was from the lives of other people. And so, for many of it, this is the way we can warn people, is by living lives that are so exemplary that people just cannot miss the fact that, hey, there's something about those people that's different. Now, what's different? The Bible uses the expression sometime in the Old King James Version that we are a peculiar people. And some people say, yes, they are very peculiar, you know. The word means a people of possession. We are God's peculiar people. And the idea was we're peculiar because we belong to Him. And so better translations say a people of God's own possession. And the important thing about this is that Ezekiel and Paul and Jesus and the great people who bore the message of the gospel in the early days, one of the great parts of their message was This is the way I live. It isn't just going to church. It isn't just reading the Bible. It isn't just praying. It's living. It's being different than what is all around you. It's the living gospel that we're talking about. And so Ezekiel is told, if you do not warn the wicked man, but he doesn't, if you do warn the wicked man, but he doesn't turn from his wickedness or from his evil ways, he will die for his sins, but you have saved yourself. That is to say, that when I discharge my responsibility, and I do it in a loving, compassionate manner, not because I'm trying to gain something for myself, heaven, but I'm doing it because of my love for the Lord and what Christ did for me on the cross. Then, when other people see the kind of person that you and I ought to be, those other people are more likely to be drawn to the Lord than if they see us as just one more face in the big crowd here. Can't tell very much difference between Christians and non-Christians. And sometimes people think, oh, that's such a wonderful compliment. You know, I'm not standing out so that people know. Jesus stood out. Paul stood out. The early Christians stood out. Why? Because they lived lives of integrity, of devotion, of worship, and of service to the Lord. If you're not a Christian tonight, God's invitation to you is to come with faith in your heart, turning away from sin, being baptized into Him. He's promised to give you a home in heaven. Let's stand together, please, and sing.